Shadows in the park. The park was alive with the sounds of children playing, the rustling of leaves, and the faint melody of birdsong. Malcolm Hayes sat on a bench near the playground, watching his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, conquer the monkey bars. Her laughter floated in the air, bright and carefree. To anyone passing by, it seemed like an idyllic Saturday afternoon. But Malcolm's sharp eyes missed nothing. A retired Navy SEAL, his instincts were always tuned to the environment. His service had taught him to sense when something wasn't right, and today, that sense was gnawing at him. Near the edge of the park, a group of men loitered by the trees. 4 of them, to be precise. They were dressed casually, but their postures were tense, their eyes restless. One man, the tallest, leaned against a tree trunk, his face partially hidden by a baseball cap. Another, wiry with a cigarette dangling from his lips, crushed the butt under his boot and glanced toward Malcolm with a sneer. Malcolm's gaze hardened. He knew trouble when he saw it. Lily called out, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Daddy, look. I made it all the way across," she shouted, beaming with pride. "Good job, baby." Malcolm called back, his smile warm. "Go try the swings now." Lily darted toward the swings, her curly hair bouncing with each step. Malcolm rose to his feet, his muscles tensed beneath his sweatshirt. He had no intention of starting trouble, but if those men came closer, he wouldn't hesitate to protect his daughter. The tall man pushed off the tree and sauntered toward Malcolm, his cronies trailing behind. The sun glinted off the man's shaved head as he stopped a few feet away, his posture casual but his eyes cold. "Nice day, isn't it?" the man said, his voice laced with mock friendliness. Malcolm didn't respond. His silence was deliberate, his expression unreadable. The man's smile turned into a sneer. "You and your little girl don't belong here." Malcolm's jaw tightened. He stepped slightly to the side, keeping Lily in his peripheral vision. "We're not bothering anyone. Why don't you mind your business?" Cigarette guy laughed, the sound sharp and grating. "Oh, you're one of those tough guys, huh? Think you can just waltz in here and act like you own the place?" "I'm here with my daughter," Malcolm replied evenly, his voice calm but firm. "I suggest you walk away." The tall man's grin widened. "Or what?" Before Malcolm could respond, another voice cut through the air. "Daddy, who are they?" Lily stood a few yards away, her small hands clutching the straps of her backpack. Her wide brown eyes were filled with confusion and a hint of fear. "It's okay, Lily," Malcolm said without looking at her. "Go sit by the bench. Stay there no matter what." Lily hesitated, then nodded and scurried to the bench. The men watched her go, their smirks turning sinister. "Smart kid," the tall man said. "Knows to listen to her daddy. Too bad she's got the wrong one." Malcolm's patience snapped. His voice dropped an octave, deadly calm. "You have 3 seconds to turn around and leave." The tall man chuckled, stepping closer. "Or what? You gonna teach us a lesson, tough guy?" Malcolm didn't reply. He let his actions speak. As the wiry man lunged at him, Malcolm sidestepped, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it sharply. The man cried out, dropping to his knees as Malcolm shoved him away. Another man swung a fist at Malcolm's head. Malcolm ducked, driving an elbow into the man's ribs. He moved with the precision of someone who had spent years in combat, every motion efficient and deliberate. The tall man barked orders, and the remaining men closed in. One swung a branch like a club, but Malcolm caught it mid-swing, yanking it free and snapping it over his knee. He used the jagged end to fend off another attacker, striking with calculated force. Lily screamed as the fight escalated. "Daddy, stop." Malcolm's focus wavered for a fraction of a second, just enough for the tall man to tackle him from behind. They hit the ground hard, and Malcolm grunted as pain shot through his ribs. He rolled, using the man's momentum to throw him off, then delivered a swift punch to his jaw. Blood dripped from Malcolm's lip as he stood, his chest heaving. The men were retreating, dragging their injured comrades with them. The tall man spat on the ground, glaring at Malcolm. "You're gonna regret this," he snarled. "This ain't over." Malcolm didn't respond. He turned toward Lily, who was sobbing by the bench. His heart ached as he knelt in front of her, ignoring the pain radiating through his body. "Daddy, are you okay?" she asked between hiccups. "I'm fine, sweetheart," he said, cupping her cheek. "But I need you to do something very important for me." Lily nodded, her tears slowing. "Take my phone," Malcolm said, handing it to her. "Call 911. Tell them what happened and where we are." Lily's hands trembled as she took the phone, but she nodded with determination. "Okay, Daddy." As she dialed, Malcolm's vision blurred. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the injuries he had ignored during the fight were catching up to him. He collapsed onto the grass, his world darkening as Lily's cries echoed in his ears. "Stay with me, Daddy," Lily sobbed, clutching his hand. "Please don't leave me." The last thing Malcolm heard before everything went black was her small braid voice telling the dispatcher, "My daddy needs help. Please hurry." A silent hero's fight. The world was a haze when Malcolm stirred. Dull pain radiated through his body, pulling him back to consciousness. His instincts told him not to move too quickly, to assess his surroundings first. Slowly, he opened his eyes, blinking against the harsh hospital lighting. Machines beeped softly around him, their rhythmic sounds a sharp contrast to the chaos he remembered at the park. "Daddy." The voice came from beside him. His daughter, Lily, was perched on the edge of her chair, her tiny fingers gripping his hand. Her wide brown eyes brimmed with tears, relief washing over her face. "Hey, sweetheart," Malcolm croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. His throat felt like sandpaper, and he winced at the sharp ache in his ribs. "You scared me," Lily said, her lower lip trembling. I thought you weren't going to wake up." Malcolm mustered a faint smile and squeezed her hand weakly. "It's going to take more than a few thugs to keep me down," Lily pad. At the sound of his nickname for her, Lily let out a watery giggle, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. The door to the room opened, and a nurse stepped in, her expression softening when she saw Malcolm awake. "Good to see you're with us, Mr. Hayes," she said, checking the monitors. "You've been out for a while. The doctors said you were lucky. 2 fractured ribs, a concussion, and a few deep bruises, but nothing life-threatening." Malcolm nodded, his focus returning to Lily. "She's okay, right?" The nurse smiled warmly. "Your daughter's fine. She's been incredibly brave through all this." As the nurse adjusted his IV drip, a sharp knock on the door announced another visitor. Officer Grace Novak, a tall woman with a commanding presence, stepped inside. Her uniform was crisp, and her hazel eyes carried a mix of professionalism and empathy. She glanced at Malcolm, then crouched to Lily's eye level. "You must be Lily," Novak said, her tone gentle. "You're a very brave girl for calling us. You helped save your dad." Lily's cheeks flushed as she clutched Malcolm's hand tighter. I didn't want him to leave me." "And you made sure he didn't," Novak said with a kind smile before turning her attention to Malcolm. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Officer Novak. I'm handling the investigation into what happened." Malcolm's expression hardened as he slowly pushed himself upright, ignoring the protests of his battered body. "What do you have on those men?" Novak's smile faded. "They fled the scene before we arrived, but we've got some leads. Witnesses at the park provided descriptions, and Lily here gave us valuable details. It's a start, but these kinds of groups know how to vanish when they want to." "They're more than just a group of thugs," Malcolm said, his voice low but firm. "They had an agenda." Novak nodded, pulling out a notepad. "That's what we're trying to determine. Do you remember anything specific they said or did?" Malcolm recounted the encounter, his words clipped and precise, honed by years of military debriefings. Novak's pen flew across the page as she jotted down every detail. They weren't there by accident, Malcolm concluded. They knew what they were doing, and they weren't just looking for trouble. They were looking for an opportunity. Novak glanced at Lily, then back at Malcolm. We think you're right. This wasn't random. We found a car abandoned a few blocks from the park. It matches the description Lily gave us, and inside, we found something chilling. Restraints, duct tape, and a map with marked locations, including the park where you were attacked. Malcolm's stomach clenched. He glanced at Lily, who was fiddling with the hem of her dress, her small face pale. His protective instincts surged, overriding his pain. They were targeting her. Novak hesitated, then nodded. It looks that way. We suspect this group is part of a larger operation, possibly a child trafficking ring. The words hit Malcolm like a freight train. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he processed the revelation. Memories of his missions overseas flashed in his mind. Operations where he dismantled networks like this. But this time, the stakes were personal. What's being done to find them? Malcolm demanded. We've issued a citywide alert and are working with federal agencies, Novak said. But these kinds of operations are complex. They're good at covering their tracks. They won't get far, Malcolm said, his voice steely. I'll make sure of it. Novak raised an eyebrow. Mr. Hayes, I understand your frustration, but you're in no condition to get involved. Don't underestimate me, officer, Malcolm replied. I've dealt with worse than this. Those men made the mistake of coming after my daughter. I won't let them get away with it. Novak studied him for a moment, then sighed. If you're determined to help, there's a way to do it without putting yourself in danger. Share your expertise. Help us analyze their tactics. Malcolm nodded, his mind already working. He would find them, no matter what it took. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in shadows, Malcolm sat in his hospital bed, reviewing the files Novak had provided. The marked locations on the map formed a pattern: parks, playgrounds, and family-friendly areas. These predators were targeting places where they could blend in and strike unnoticed. Lily was asleep in a chair beside him, her small frame curled under a blanket. Naomi, her mother, entered the room quietly, her heels clicking softly on the linoleum floor. She glanced at Malcolm, her expression a mix of relief and anger. You shouldn't have taken her there, Naomi said, her voice low but sharp. She's not safe with you. Malcolm didn't look up. She's not safe anywhere if these men are still out there. Naomi's arms crossed. You don't have to do this alone. Let the police handle it. They don't know these men like I do, Malcolm said, finally meeting her gaze. They're predators, Naomi. They thrive on fear and chaos. I won't let them take our daughter or anyone else's. Naomi's resolve wavered, and she sighed. You're as stubborn as ever. And you wouldn't have it any other way, Malcolm replied with a faint smirk. Naomi sat down, her shoulders slumping. What's the plan? We find them, Malcolm said simply, and we make sure they can never hurt anyone again. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of the city, Bryce Dalton paced angrily, his fists clenched. The attack on Malcolm had not gone as planned, and now the police were closing in. We should have grabbed the girl when we had the chance, one of his men muttered. Bryce spun on him, his eyes blazing. You think I don't know that? That man wasn't just some nobody. He fought like he's seen combat. So what do we do? Another asked nervously. Bryce smirked, a sinister gleam in his eyes. We send a message. He wants to play the hero. Let's see how far he's willing to go. As his men scattered to prepare, Bryce leaned against a table, his mind racing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The hunt begins. Malcolm Hayes sat in his hospital bed, surrounded by maps, photos, and notes spread across the small table. Despite the fatigue etched into his face and the ache in his ribs, his mind was sharp, fueled by a mixture of adrenaline and a father's unrelenting determination. Every detail mattered. Every lead was a potential thread to pull. He wasn't just piecing together the attack. He was planning the takedown. "Daddy?" Lily's small voice broke the silence. Malcolm looked up to see her standing beside the bed, clutching her stuffed bear. Her eyes were wide, filled with questions she was too young to articulate fully. "What is it, Lilypad?" he asked, softening his voice. "Are the bad men still out there?" Malcolm's heart clenched. He hated the fear in her voice, the way her innocence had been shaken. "They are," he admitted, "but they won't get far. The police are looking for them, and so am I." Lily hesitated, then climbed onto the edge of the bed. "Can you stop them?" Malcolm leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I promise you, Lily, they won't hurt anyone else." The door opened, and Officer Grace Novak stepped in, carrying a tablet and a thick file. She paused when she saw Lily, offering the little girl a warm smile. "Hi, Lily. How about I show you the snack machine down the hall?" Novak asked. Lily glanced at her father, who nodded. "Go on, sweetheart. I'll be right here." Once Lily was out of the room, Novak placed the tablet on the table and sat across from Malcolm. Her usual professional demeanor was tinged with urgency. "We've got a development." Malcolm straightened, wincing slightly at the movement. "What is it?" Novak pulled up an image on the tablet. It was a grainy photo of a dark sedan, its license plate partially visible. "We traced the car abandoned near the park. It was stolen 2 days before the attack. Surveillance cameras picked it up at a gas station just outside the city. Guess who was driving?" "Bryce Dalton," Malcolm said, his tone hard. Novak nodded. "Exactly. The footage also shows one of his crew loading supplies into the trunk. Restraints, duct tape, chloroform. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. They've been planning this." Malcolm's jaw tightened. Any sign of where they're hiding? "We've narrowed it down to a few locations," Novak replied, pulling out a map. She pointed to several circled areas. "They seem to favor abandoned industrial sites on the outskirts of the city. These are places they can operate without drawing attention." Malcolm studied the map, his mind working quickly. "They're staying mobile. They won't stay in one place for long." "Exactly," Novak agreed. "We're preparing to raid one of these locations tonight. We need your insight to make sure we don't miss anything." Malcolm looked her square in the eye. "I'm coming with you." Novak raised a hand. "Absolutely not. You're in no condition." "I don't care," Malcolm interrupted, his voice firm. "These men came after my daughter. This isn't just a case to me. It's personal." Novak hesitated, then sighed. "You can't physically be on the ground with us, but I'll let you sit in on the operation as a consultant. Fair?" Malcolm reluctantly nodded. "Fair." That night, the precinct buzzed with controlled chaos as officers suited up for the raid. Malcolm sat in a chair near the command station, a headset resting over his ears. On the screens before him, live drone footage displayed the target site, an abandoned factory on the edge of town. Novak stood beside him, issuing orders into her radio. "Team Alpha, take position at the east entrance. Team Bravo, cover the rear. We want this quiet until we have eyes on all suspects." Malcolm leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the screen. The factory was a maze of rusted metal and crumbling walls. He could see faint movements inside, shadows flitting past broken windows. "They're on edge," he said. "They know they're being hunted." Novak nodded. "That makes them more dangerous." The team moved in silence, their black tactical gear blending into the shadows. Malcolm's voice cut through the comms. "Watch that second floor. Someone's keeping lookout." The lead officer gestured, and a sharpshooter took position, neutralizing the sentry with a tranquilizer dart. The man slumped over, unconscious. "Clear to proceed," the team leader reported. The officers breached the factory, moving with precision. Inside, they found a chilling scene. Crates of stolen goods, counterfeit documents, and a locked room containing more restraints and tools of abduction. The air was heavy with the stench of mildew and decay. But Bryce Dalton was nowhere to be found. In a dimly lit room across town, Bryce paced angrily, his fists clenched. The news of the raid had reached him through one of his lookouts. His operation was crumbling, and his crew was scattered. "We need to move," one of his men said nervously. "The cops are closing in." Bryce glared at him. "We're not running." "Not yet. That man, Malcolm, he humiliated us, made us look weak. I want him to suffer." "How?" another asked. "The cops are protecting him now." Bryce smirked, a sinister glint in his eyes. "Everyone's got a weak spot. His is that little girl." The room fell silent. Bryce's men exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared to question him. Back at the hospital, Malcolm paced the small room, frustration boiling beneath his calm exterior. The raid had been a partial success. They'd disrupted the operation, but Bryce was still at large, and the knowledge that the man who had threatened his daughter was out there, plotting his next move, was like a weight on his chest. Naomi entered the room, her expression tense. "Any news?" Malcolm shook his head. "Not the news we need." Naomi sighed, crossing her arms. "Lily's scared. She won't let me leave her side." "She has every right to be," Malcolm said. "But I won't let them touch her." Naomi hesitated, then spoke softly. "I don't like this, Malcolm. You putting yourself back into danger. But I'm glad you're fighting for her." Malcolm's eyes softened. "I've fought wars for strangers. I'd go to hell and back for Lily." Naomi nodded, her resolve firming. "Then let's do this together. Whatever it takes." Before Malcolm could respond, his phone buzzed. Novik's voice came through urgent. "Malcolm, we've got chatter. Bryce is making his move." Malcolm's heart pounded. "Where?" "A residential neighborhood, just outside the city," Novik replied. "He's targeting another family." "Not on my watch," Malcolm growled. He grabbed his jacket, ignoring the pain in his ribs. "I'm coming." Naomi stepped in front of him. "You're hurt. You can't." "I can't sit here and do nothing," Malcolm said. "Not when someone else's child is in danger." Naomi stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Fine, but I'm coming too." The convoy of police vehicles roared through the night, sirens cutting through the still air. Malcolm sat in the front seat of Novik's car, his fists clenched. He wasn't just chasing Bryce, he was making a promise. This ended tonight. The Trap Titans. The police convoy pulled into the quiet residential neighborhood, their flashing lights dimmed to avoid drawing attention. Officer Novak killed the engine and turned to Malcolm, her expression serious. "This isn't going to be a field mission like you're used to, Hayes. You stay in the car unless I say otherwise." Malcolm didn't reply, his sharp gaze scanning the area. The street was eerily silent, lined with cookie-cutter homes and manicured lawns. Lights flickered in a few windows, but most houses were dark, their occupants oblivious to the danger lurking nearby. Naomi sat in the back seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She had insisted on coming, and while Novik had initially protested, the look in Naomi's eyes, a mother's fierce determination, had silenced her objections. They all knew the stakes were too high for anyone to sit this one out. Novik's radio crackled. "Unit Alpha in position," a voice reported. "No visual on suspects yet." "Copy that," Novik replied. She turned to Malcolm. "We've got officers covering every exit. If Bryce is here, he won't slip through." Malcolm nodded but said nothing. His instincts told him something was off. Bryce wasn't the type to walk blindly into a trap. He was calculating, methodical. Whatever his plan was, it wouldn't be straightforward. As if on cue, Novik's radio buzzed again. Suspicious activity at the northeast corner. Possible movement near the alleyway. Novik grabbed her flashlight. "Stay here," she ordered before stepping out of the car. Malcolm waited until she was out of sight, then turned to Naomi. "You stay put. No arguments." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "Figure out what Bryce's endgame is," Malcolm replied. Without waiting for her response, he slipped out of the car, his movements quiet and precise despite his injuries. The alleyway was narrow and dark, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp at the far end. Novak and two officers moved cautiously, their weapons drawn. The faint sound of something metal clinking echoed in the stillness. "Hold position," Novak whispered, signaling for her team to spread out. Malcolm watched from a distance, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows. Something about the setup didn't feel right. Then he saw it, a glint of red light, barely visible against the brick wall. His stomach dropped. "Novak," he hissed, stepping out of the shadows. "It's a trap." Novak turned to him, her expression one of confusion and irritation. "What are you?" Before she could finish, a loud explosion ripped through the alley, sending debris flying. The force of the blast knocked everyone to the ground, and Malcolm shielded his face as shards of glass and concrete rained down. When the dust settled, Malcolm pushed himself to his feet, his ribs screaming in protest. The alley was in ruins, smoke billowing from a scorched dumpster. Novak groaned nearby, clutching her shoulder as she struggled to stand. "Everyone accounted for," Malcolm called, his voice hoarse. "We're here," one of the officers coughed, helping Novak up. "What the hell was that?" "A distraction," Malcolm said grimly. "Bryce knew we were coming. He wanted to draw us here while he made his move." Novak's eyes widened. "The houses, he's after the families." Malcolm didn't waste another second. He bolted back toward the street, ignoring the pain that lanced through his body with every step. If Bryce was targeting another family, time was running out. Meanwhile, in a modest home 2 blocks away, the Carter family was settling in for the night. Sarah Carter tucked her 6-year-old son, Ben, into bed, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "Good night, sweetheart," she said, kissing his cheek. "Good night, Mommy," Ben replied sleepily. As Sarah turned off the light and closed his door, she heard a faint noise from downstairs, a soft thud, like something being knocked over. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. "David," she called, stepping into the hallway. Her husband was supposed to be in the living room, but the house was eerily quiet. "David, is that you?" When there was no response, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She reached for her phone, but before she could dial, a shadowy figure appeared at the bottom of the stairs. "Don't scream," the man said, his voice low and menacing. A gun gleamed in his hand. Sarah's breath caught as she backed away. "Please, we don't have anything valuable." "This isn't about money," the man sneered. It was Bryce Dalton. Malcolm reached the Carter home just as Sarah's muffled scream pierced the night. He didn't hesitate, sprinting toward the house and kicking in the front door. The sound startled Bryce, who turned just in time to see Malcolm charging toward him. "You again," Bryce growled, raising his gun. Malcolm moved like lightning, his SEAL training kicking in. He grabbed Bryce's wrist, twisting it sharply. The gun clattered to the floor as the 2 men grappled, their movements violent and desperate. "Go. Get your son and get out," Malcolm shouted to Sarah, who stood frozen in shock. She nodded frantically and rushed upstairs. Bryce fought like a cornered animal, his fists landing heavy blows on Malcolm's injured ribs. But Malcolm refused to go down. He delivered a brutal punch to Bryce's jaw, sending him staggering backward. "You think you can stop me?" Bryce spat, blood dripping from his lip. "You're just one man." "One man is all it takes," Malcolm replied, his voice cold. The fight was brutal and unrelenting. Bryce managed to grab a knife from his boot, slashing at Malcolm's arm. Pain flared, but Malcolm didn't falter. He used Bryce's momentum against him, slamming him into the wall with enough force to crack the plaster. Outside, police sirens wailed as Novak and her team arrived. Officers stormed the house, weapons drawn. "Freeze," Novak shouted, training her gun on Bryce. Breathing heavily, Malcolm stepped back, letting the officers take over. Bryce snarled, but didn't resist as they cuffed him and dragged him outside. As the chaos subsided, Malcolm leaned against the wall, his body screaming for rest. Sarah emerged from upstairs, clutching Ben tightly. Tears streamed down her face as she approached Malcolm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You saved us." Malcolm nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at the terrified child in her arms. "No one messes with family," he said simply. Novak approached, her expression a mix of relief and respect. "That was reckless, Hayes, but damn effective. Bryce is in custody, and his operation just crumbled." "It's not over," Malcolm said, his voice steadied despite his exhaustion. "There's more out there, bigger players pulling the strings." "We'll take it from here," Novak assured him. "You've done enough." Malcolm didn't argue. For now, Bryce was off the streets, and Lily was safe, but deep down, he knew the fight was far from over. Later that night, Malcolm returned to the hospital, his body battered but his spirit unbroken. Lily was waiting for him, her eyes lighting up as he entered the room. "Daddy," she cried, rushing to hug him. Malcolm winced but held her tightly, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I told you I'd protect you, didn't I?" As he tucked her into bed, Naomi watched from the doorway, a small smile on her lips. For the first time in years, they felt like a team, a family united by love and an unshakable determination to stand against the darkness. Digging deeper, the morning sunlight streamed through the hospital room's blinds, casting soft patterns on the walls. Malcolm Hayes sat at the edge of the bed, his ribs tightly bandaged and his arm in a sling. His battered body told the story of the chaos from the night before, but his eyes remained sharp, his mind already working. "Malcolm," Naomi's voice called gently from the doorway. She stepped inside, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. Her face was a mixture of concern and admiration. "You should be resting." He took the cup she offered, nodding in thanks. "I'll rest when this is over. Bryce might be behind bars, but his operation isn't done. Someone's still pulling the strings." Naomi sighed, sitting in the chair beside him. "You can't take all of this on yourself. The police are handling it now." "They'll do what they can," Malcolm replied, his tone low but resolute. "But they don't think like these people. They don't know how they operate. I do." Naomi frowned. "You think there's more to it?" "I don't think," Malcolm said, taking a slow sip of coffee. "I know." Officer Novak arrived a short time later, carrying a thick folder and a laptop. She pulled up a chair and spread the documents across the small table. "Bryce isn't talking," she began, her expression grim. "But we've been combing through everything we found at his safe house. Financial records, burner phones, coded messages. It's all leading to someone much bigger." Malcolm leaned forward, his sharp eyes scanning the pages. "Who?" Novak opened a file, revealing a photo of a man in his late 40s with sharp features and a smug smile. "His name's Victor Kane. Wealthy philanthropist on the surface, but he's suspected of running a sophisticated trafficking network. He's careful, uses middlemen like Bryce to do the dirty work." Malcolm's jaw tightened. If Kane's involved, this isn't just local. It's international. "Exactly," Novak said. "We've been trying to connect him to the trafficking ring for years, but he's slippery. No direct evidence, and his public persona keeps him untouchable." Malcolm's mind raced. Kane's type was always the same, men who hid behind layers of protection, using their wealth and influence as a shield. They thought they were untouchable. He had taken down men like Kane before, and he wasn't about to stop now. "I need access to everything you've got on him," Malcolm said. Novak hesitated. "Malcolm, this isn't a solo mission. If Kane catches wind that you're digging into his operations, you'll have a target on your back." "I've had a target on my back before," Malcolm said, I know how to handle it. Naomi, who had been quietly listening, stood. And what about Lily? She just got her father back. You can't keep throwing yourself into danger. Malcolm's gaze softened as he looked at her. This isn't just for Lily. It's for every family out there. If we let people like Cain keep operating, more children will be taken, more lives destroyed. I can't live with that. Naomi shook her head, exhaling slowly. You're impossible. But if you're doing this, you're not doing it alone. Malcolm started to protest, but she cut him off. Don't even start. I've seen what you're up against, and I'm not sitting on the sidelines. Novak watched the exchange, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Looks like you've got yourself a team. That evening, Malcolm, Novak, and Naomi set up in a safe house provided by the police. The room was small but secure, filled with computers, maps, and files. Naomi took charge of organizing the evidence, her sharp mind proving invaluable in connecting dots the police had overlooked. Malcolm studied the surveillance footage of Cain's mansion, a sprawling estate surrounded by high walls and state-of-the-art security. Cain's got resources, he said. If we're going after him, we need to do it smart. Novak nodded, pulling up a blueprint of the estate. We're working on getting a warrant, but Cain's lawyers are already stalling. If we can find something concrete, we can move faster. Malcolm pointed to the estate's security system. He's got blind spots here and here. If we can get someone inside to plant a bug, we'll have access to his communications. Novak raised an eyebrow. And who exactly is going to sneak into one of the most secure estates in the city? I will, Malcolm said without hesitation. Naomi looked up sharply. You can barely move without wincing. How are you going to pull off a stealth mission? I've done more with less, Malcolm replied. And Cain won't see me coming. Novak sighed. If you're going in, you're going to need backup. I'll coordinate from here. The next night, under the cover of darkness, Malcolm approached Cain's estate. Dressed in black, he moved with the practiced precision of a man who had spent years in hostile territory. His ribs ached with every step, but he pushed the pain aside, his focus unshakable. Using the blind spots in the security system, he scaled the wall and dropped silently onto the grounds. The mansion loomed ahead, its windows glowing softly. Malcolm spotted a security camera and timed his movements perfectly, slipping past its range and reaching the side of the house. He retrieved a small device from his pocket, a high-tech bug provided by Novak, and attached it to the mansion's power box. The device blinked green, signaling success. Just as Malcolm turned to leave, a faint sound reached his ears. Footsteps. He pressed himself against the wall, his heart pounding. 2 guards rounded the corner, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Thought I saw something over here, one of them muttered. Malcolm waited until they passed, then moved quickly, his steps silent. He reached the wall and scaled it again, disappearing into the night. Back at the safe house, Novak's computer lit up as the bug came online. We're in, she said, her voice triumphant. Malcolm collapsed into a chair, wincing as he adjusted his sling. What are we looking at? Novak began sifting through the data, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Encrypted emails, phone logs. Wait. She paused, her eyes narrowing. There's a message here. A meeting scheduled for tomorrow night. Cain's hosting a private event at a warehouse downtown. Malcolm leaned forward. That's where he'll make his move. Naomi frowned. And what's the plan? Storm the place and hope he doesn't escape. Malcolm shook his head. We'll let him think he's safe. Then we take him down, along with everyone else involved. Novak nodded. I'll coordinate with the SWAT team. This has to be airtight. No room for error. Malcolm glanced at Naomi, his eyes serious. I need you to stay here with Lily. If anything goes wrong. Don't, Naomi said firmly. You're coming back. We're finishing this together. The stage was set. The next night, as Cain's event unfolded, Malcolm prepared for the final confrontation. He wasn't just fighting for Lily or himself. He was fighting for every family that had been torn apart by men like Cain. As the clock ticked down, Malcolm's resolve hardened. This would end tonight, the night before the storm. Malcolm sat in the quiet of the safe house, the faint hum of Novik's computers filling the room. He studied the layout of the warehouse where Victor Cain's meeting would take place. It was an unassuming location on the surface, nestled in a forgotten industrial district. But Malcolm knew better. For Cain, this was likely a fortress. Across the room, Naomi tucked Lily into a makeshift bed. The little girl clutched her stuffed bear tightly, her small face scrunching in unease. "Are the bad men still coming for us?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. Naomi's heart clenched as she sat on the edge of the bed, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead. "No, sweetie. Daddy and the police are going to make sure they can't hurt anyone anymore. Promise." Lily whispered, her big eyes searching her mother's face. "I promise," Naomi said firmly, kissing her on the forehead. Malcolm turned from the table, his gaze softening as he watched the two. He stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "Hey, Lily Pad. You know what makes me strong?" Lily tilted her head, curious despite her fear. "You," Malcolm said, kneeling beside her bed despite the pain in his ribs. "Every time I get knocked down, I think about you, about keeping you safe. That's my superpower. And that's why I'll never let anyone hurt you." Lily managed a small smile and reached out to hug him, her tiny arms wrapping around his neck. "I love you, Daddy." "I love you too, Lily Pad," Malcolm whispered, holding her tightly. Later that evening, after Lily had fallen asleep, Naomi joined Malcolm at the table. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her voice was steady. "She believes in you." Malcolm met her gaze. "I won't let her down." Naomi nodded, sitting beside him. "What's the plan?" Malcolm tapped the warehouse blueprint. "Cain's using this meeting to regroup. He knows we're closing in, so he's likely consolidating his power, bringing his key players together to strategize." Novik chimed in from her station. "We've intercepted chatter suggesting the meeting is more than just strategy. Cain's finalizing a deal with international traffickers. If we catch him in the act, we'll have the evidence to dismantle his entire network." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Then we can't afford to wait. We go in during the meeting." Naomi frowned. "And what happens if it's a trap? You've seen how far Cain's willing to go. That's why we need to control the narrative," Malcolm said. "We can't storm the warehouse blindly. We need eyes on the inside." Novak raised an eyebrow. "You planning to sneak in again?" Malcolm shook his head. "No. This time, we send a distraction." Naomi leaned forward. "What kind of distraction?" The plan was bold, bordering on reckless, but it was the only way to gain the upper hand. Novak had connections within the local SWAT team, and they agreed to coordinate a staged disruption at a decoy location nearby. The false threat would draw Cain's outer guards away, thinning his defenses at the warehouse. While the SWAT team prepared, Malcolm focused on creating a fallback plan. He rigged a small drone with a surveillance camera, ensuring they'd have real-time visuals inside the warehouse. If anything went wrong, it would serve as their lifeline. As the hours ticked by, the tension in the safe house grew. Naomi paced the room, her mind racing with possibilities. What if he escapes? What if he slips through your fingers again? "He won't," Malcolm said firmly. "This ends tomorrow." Naomi stopped pacing, her eyes locking onto his. "And what happens after that?" "You've spent years fighting battles, Malcolm. When does it stop?" "When Lily can go to a park without me scanning every shadow," Malcolm replied. "When families don't have to look over their shoulders. That's when it stops." Naomi's gaze softened. "You're a good father, Malcolm. Even when I doubted you, I always knew that." Malcolm nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Thanks." As the clock struck midnight, the team finalized their preparations. Novak stood at the center of the room, her voice firm, as she addressed the group. "We hit the decoy site first," she said. "The goal is to pull as many guards away from Kane as possible. Once the warehouse perimeter is compromised, Malcolm and I will move in with the second team." "And me?" Naomi asked. "You're staying here with Lily," Novak replied. "She needs you." Naomi looked like she wanted to argue, but reluctantly nodded. "Be careful." "We will," Malcolm promised. As the team dispersed, Malcolm stood by the window, staring out into the night. The city lights flickered in the distance, a reminder of the countless lives Kane's operation had touched. This wasn't just about revenge or justice. It was about ensuring no one else had to endure what Lily had. Naomi approached him, her voice soft. "Do you ever wonder what life would have been like if things were different? If you'd never gone into the Navy?" Malcolm glanced at her. "Sometimes. But I wouldn't trade it. The things I learned, the people I saved, it led me here. To this moment. To protecting what matters most." Naomi smiled faintly. "Lily's lucky to have you." "We're both lucky to have her," Malcolm replied. He took a deep breath, his gaze hardening. "Tomorrow, it's over." The hours crept by, and dawn began to break. Malcolm stood by the table, his gear ready. Novak arrived, her SWAT vest strapped tightly, and gave him a nod. "It's time," she said. Malcolm turned to Naomi, who was holding Lily's sleeping form. "Keep her safe," he said. "I will," Naomi replied, her voice steady. "And you come back in one piece." Malcolm kissed Lily's forehead, then followed Novak out the door. The mission was clear, the stakes higher than ever. As the convoy of unmarked vehicles sped toward the warehouse, Malcolm's thoughts were singular. This would be the last time Kane hurt anyone. The final showdown. The convoy approached the industrial district, the city's skyline giving way to rows of derelict warehouses and forgotten factories. The faint glow of streetlights cast long shadows, making the area feel like a ghost town. Malcolm Hayes sat in the lead vehicle, his sharp eyes fixed on the target ahead. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its grim exterior hiding the web of evil inside. Officer Novik's voice crackled through the comms. "Team Alpha, take positions at the decoy site. Team Bravo, maintain a perimeter around the warehouse. No one in or out unless we give the green light." Malcolm adjusted his earpiece, his body tense but ready. Every muscle ached, but he pushed the pain aside. He had faced worse. This wasn't just another mission. It was the culmination of everything he'd fought for. The decoy. At the decoy site, a few blocks away, SWAT officers moved into position, their heavy boots crunching softly against gravel. They breached the abandoned building with precision, flashbangs exploding inside to create chaos. The ruse worked like clockwork. Reports came through the comms as Kane's outer guards peeled away, heading toward the disturbance. Novak glanced at Malcolm. "That's our opening. We move now." Malcolm nodded, his hand brushing over the sidearm strapped to his leg. He knew the plan was dangerous. Kane wouldn't go down without a fight. Breaching the warehouse. The warehouse was eerily quiet as Novak's team approached. Malcolm trailed behind the first wave, his sharp instincts alert to every creak and shadow. The perimeter guards were gone, but that didn't mean the building was empty. Novak signaled to her team, and they breached the side entrance, moving in with tactical precision. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of crates and scaffolding, dimly lit by flickering overhead lights. Malcolm's sharp eyes caught movement in the shadows, a flash of a figure slipping behind a stack of crates. "They're still here," Malcolm whispered into the comms. "Watch the corners." The team fanned out, sweeping the area. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, the air grew heavier, filled with the metallic tang of oil and damp concrete. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the far end of the room. "Welcome, Mr. Hayes," Victor Kane's smooth tone called out, dripping with mockery. "I've been expecting you." Malcolm's jaw tightened as he stepped forward, his eyes scanning the darkened space. Kane emerged from the shadows, flanked by two armed men. He looked every bit the confident mastermind, his tailored suit stark against the grim surroundings. "Do you really think you've won?" Kane asked, his voice calm. "You're just another player in a game you can't possibly understand." "Your game's over," Malcolm replied, his tone cold. "There's no place for cowards like you to hide." Kane chuckled, spreading his arms theatrically. "You're bold, I'll give you that. But boldness won't save you, or your daughter." Malcolm's blood ran cold at the mention of Lily. His grip on his weapon tightened, his voice deadly calm. "Say her name again, and it'll be the last thing you ever say." Kane smirked. "Touchy. But it doesn't matter. Even if you kill me, the machine keeps running. You can't stop what's already in motion." The fight. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Kane's men raised their weapons, and Novik's team opened fire. The warehouse erupted into chaos as bullets ricocheted off metal beams and crates. Malcolm moved with the precision of a soldier, ducking behind cover and returning fire. One of Kane's guards charged toward him, swinging a crowbar. Malcolm sidestepped the attack, disarming the man with a swift twist before delivering a brutal punch to his jaw. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Novik's voice came through the comms. "We've got movement on the second floor. Additional hostiles." "Copy that," Malcolm replied, his eyes darting upward. He spotted a staircase and made his way toward it, his steps silent but purposeful. The confrontation. On the second floor, Malcolm found Kane standing near a desk cluttered with papers and a laptop. The sound of gunfire echoed below, but Kane seemed unfazed. He turned to face Malcolm, his expression smug. "You're persistent," Kane said. "I'll give you that." "Hands where I can see them," Malcolm ordered, his weapon trained on the man. Kane raised his hand slowly, his smirk never wavering. "You think you've won, don't you? But I already made arrangements. This little setback is nothing." Malcolm stepped closer, his gaze hard. "You talk too much." With a swift motion, he slammed Kane against the desk, pinning him down. Kane grunted in pain, but his smugness didn't falter. "Arresting me won't stop this," he hissed. "You're fighting a war you can't win." Malcolm leaned in, his voice low. "I've won wars you can't even imagine. This is no different." Kane's laptop screen caught Malcolm's attention, a map of international shipping routes displayed prominently. His stomach turned as he realized the scope of Kane's operation. This wasn't just a local trafficking ring, it was global. "Backup arrives." As Malcolm cuffed Kane, the sound of helicopters filled the air. Novik's voice came through the comms. "Federal backup just arrived. Kane's not going anywhere." The firefight below subsided as SWAT teams cleared the remaining guards. Novak appeared at the top of the stairs, her expression triumphant. "We've got him." Malcolm handed Kane off to the waiting officers. "Make sure he doesn't slip through the cracks." "We've got enough evidence to bury him," Novak assured him. This is the end of the line for Kane. The aftermath. Hours later, Malcolm returned to the safe house, his body exhausted but his mind at ease for the first time in days. Naomi greeted him at the door, her face lighting up with relief. "Is it over?" she asked. "It's over," Malcolm replied. "Kane's in custody. His network is falling apart." Naomi threw her arms around him, careful of his injuries. "You did it." "We did it," Malcolm corrected, glancing at Novak, who stood nearby. "It took all of us." Lily ran into the room, her face lighting up when she saw her father. "Daddy." Malcolm knelt down, wincing slightly as he caught her in a hug. "Hey, Lilypad. I told you I'd come back." "You're my hero," Lily said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Malcolm's heart swelled as he held her close. For the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Hope that the world could be safer, one battle at a time. Epilogue. Months later, Victor Kane stood trial, the mountain of evidence ensuring a swift conviction. His operation was dismantled, and the families he had torn apart began to find justice. Malcolm, Naomi, and Lily began rebuilding their lives, stronger and closer than ever. Though the scars of their ordeal remained, they found solace in the knowledge that they had faced the darkness and prevailed. And as Malcolm watched Lily play in the park once more, her laughter ringing out freely, he knew one thing for certain: no matter the odds, he would always fight for his family. Closing the circle. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the sentence. Victor Kane stood motionless, his smug demeanor finally replaced with a blank stare as he processed the reality of his fate. Life imprisonment. No parole. The network he had painstakingly built over decades was now a crumbled empire, dismantled piece by piece thanks to the evidence Malcolm, Novak, and the task force had collected. Malcolm sat in the gallery with Naomi and Lily by his side. Novak was a few rows ahead, her usual stoic expression softened by the relief of victory. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, Malcolm leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. It wasn't just relief, it was closure. Rebuilding. The weeks following Kane's sentencing were a mix of healing and reflection. Malcolm focused on physical therapy to mend his injuries, but the deeper healing came from reconnecting with his family. He had spent so much of his life on missions, always preparing for the next battle. For the first time, he allowed himself to slow down and enjoy moments that felt ordinary yet extraordinary. Watching Lily color at the kitchen table, cooking dinner with Naomi, and sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee as the sun set, Lily began to regain her sense of safety. The nightmares that once plagued her became less frequent, replaced by the warmth of her father's reassuring presence. Naomi noticed the change in Malcolm too. His edges seemed softer, his focus less on the dangers of the world and more on the love within their home. "You're different," Naomi said one evening as they stood together in the kitchen. "Different how?" Malcolm asked, pouring her a glass of wine. "You're here," she replied simply. "Not just physically, you're present." Malcolm smiled, his eyes warm. "I realized something out there, during all of this. Fighting to protect the people you love is important, but being with them, that's the real fight." Naomi's eyes glistened, and she reached for his hand. "You've always been a fighter, Malcolm, but I think you're finally learning how to live." The park revisited. Months later, on a crisp Saturday morning, Malcolm and Lily returned to the park where it all began. Lily raced ahead, her curls bouncing as she darted toward the swings. She had asked to come back, saying she wasn't afraid anymore. Malcolm couldn't have been prouder. Naomi sat beside him on the bench, her hand resting lightly on his. "She's resilient, just like her father." "She's stronger than I'll ever be," Malcolm said, watching as Lily pumped her legs, soaring higher and higher. Her laughter filled the air, free and unburdened. Naomi smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We all are." Malcolm watched the family scattered across the park, the children playing without a care in the world. He knew the fight against darkness wasn't over. It never truly was. But he also knew that his family was safe, that he had done everything in his power to ensure it. And for the first time in years, he felt at peace. A new mission. Though Malcolm had officially retired from the Navy SEALs, the events with Kane ignited a new purpose in him. Using his skills and connections, he began working with organizations dedicated to dismantling trafficking networks. He became a quiet force behind the scenes, training others, advising task forces, and ensuring no child or family would have to endure what his did. It wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about justice, about making the world just a little bit safer. "You'll always find a fight," Naomi teased one day as she watched him prepare materials for a seminar he was leading. "It's in my blood," Malcolm admitted with a grin. "But this time, I get to come home after." Naomi kissed his cheek. "Good, because we're not letting you go again." Legacy of strength. Years later, Lily would remember the events that shaped her childhood, not as a story of fear, but as one of resilience. Her father became her greatest inspiration, a man who showed her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to stand against it. She carried that lesson with her, becoming an advocate for others, ensuring her father's legacy lived on. Malcolm's scars, both physical and emotional, became reminders of what he had overcome. They weren't marks of pain. They were badges of honor, proof of his unwavering love for his family. As the sun set on another quiet evening, Malcolm stood on the porch, watching Lily play in the yard with her friends. Naomi joined him, handing him a mug of tea. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Think we'll ever get used to this?" Malcolm asked, his voice tinged with contentment. Naomi smiled. "We've earned it. You've earned it." And as Malcolm watched his daughter laugh, her joy untainted by the shadows they had fought so hard to escape, he knew she was right. They had faced the darkness together, and together they had found the light.